Welcome to an Our Father's House broadcast with Amanda Clinton.
Good morning, Accra. Welcome to Our Father's House with me, Amanda Clinton. This morning I'm going to be sharing a particular message with you, and that message is essentially Paul's vision and his thorn as contained in 2 Corinthians 12 from verse 7. And I'm concentrating on Paul's vision, the Apostle Paul's vision and his thorn, because often in life I think, we have a form of thorn in our flesh, be it with a sacrifice that we're making day to day, or be it because of a point of weakness, be it spiritual, emotional or physical. So I thought I'd concentrate on Paul's thorn in the flesh in order to reach you this morning at your point of need, your point of weakness, or indeed your point of pain. And if you have your Bibles with you, therefore, please go with me to 2 Corinthians 12 from verse 7. Once again, 2 Corinthians 12 from verse 7. To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassing great revelations, there was given to me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. And that's just taken from 2 Corinthians 12, from verse 7 to 10, essentially. Because on Our Father's House today, I'm concentrating on Paul's thorn in the flesh, in that he faces constant source of pain, and he never really says in the text what that pain was, if it was physical, if it was emotional, if it was because he was bearing the sacrifices of being a disciple. And yet, in not telling us what exactly that thorn was, it helps us because as individuals we can, with our own problems, identify with that particular need. But several possibilities have been proposed as to what Paul was referring to when he was talking about that thorn in his flesh. And some people argue that it might have been a pain in the ear or head. He might have felt unruly fleshly lusts in terms of being unmarried and yet having the lusts of the flesh. It might have been his stammering speech, because Paul often referred to the fact that people often mocked him because his words were weighty in terms of his letters, but yet in appearance he wasn't very strong in terms of his speech. And Paul's thorn in the flesh might also have been malarial fever in terms of his, going back and forth to different cities and towns to spreading the message, and he might have been overcome with several physical ailments. An ailment that could also be a possibility was his eye problems, because as we know, on the road to Damascus, he was blinded, and yet he received his vision. So, there are all these sort of possibilities as to what Paul was referring to in 2 Corinthians when he talks about the thorn in his flesh. But ultimately, this ambiguity of the thorn in the flesh is actually a positive thing, because if the Apostle Paul would have specifically stated the identity of his thorn, believers and from generation to generations may have discarded his experience if they were not afflicted with the same affliction. However, Christians for many generations have benefited by the Apostle Paul's reference to that thorn in his flesh, whilst applying it to their specific problem, essentially. And this messenger of Satan that Paul was referring to, in leaving it blank in terms of what specifically what he was referring to, we can identify them with that, because be it an emotional, spiritual or a physical pain that we're going through, we can connect to that text, because essentially Paul overcame, because the the revelation that he received was essentially that God will not take away that thorn in the flesh, because it made him stronger, because the Apostle Paul concludes that he was stronger in his weakness, because he did not have to exalt himself. He was humbled in knowing that he had a weakness that he could never get away from. So everything that was weak in him in terms of that point of weakness, be it physical, emotional, spiritual, eventually became stronger for him, I suppose, because in his weakness he could be made stronger. In his weakness he could be refined by adversity. In his weakness he could be refined by hardship. And so with Paul's message about his vision and his thorn in 2 Corinthians 12, we are uplifted, because ultimately we know as believers that we may be tested, but in all things, in all trials, we will ultimately overcome. In terms of, with the grace of God, we will overcome. So in our lives, when we apply that text to our lives, we can apply it because we can identify the fact that even if it is opponents that are coming against us in terms of their devices, even if it is the devil that's coming against us in his devices, even if the problem might seem so huge in our life in terms of we don't see the end of the situation, we can overcome eventually, because we also see how the Apostle Paul overcame by ultimately identifying the fact that in his weakness he could ultimately be made stronger. And the thorn was given, as it also states in the text, because Paul was he was someone who received a lot of revelations in terms of on the road to Damascus, as we see in Acts 9 from verse 3, in Jerusalem, in Corinth, in Jerusalem, and in just receiving constant visions. And in receiving these visions, he had a particular gift, should I say, in terms of he had the gift of prophecy, the gift of seeing and revealing visions. And so this thorn in his side was given as a buffet to him, so that he wouldn't be exalted beyond measure, essentially, so that he would be humbled in all circumstance, because even though he continued to receive these visions, even though he continued to be separated from the other men of God who had been called, even though he continued to be separated from man in terms of being gifted, being set apart, being special, he was always humbled in the fact that he had this thorn in his side, and he never reveals what this thorn was. It could have been a physical thorn because of his past. It could have been a spiritual thorn in terms of he was originally born from the Jewish race, a tribe of the Jews, a Jew of all Jews, and yet he was going against that training and fighting for Christians and fighting on behalf of Christians because he became a Christian. And so we never know if that thorn Paul had was because of his new spiritual walk, if it was because of his physical ailments, or indeed because of his physical ailments in enduring. But ultimately we are uplifted by his text, because in all things we are made stronger ultimately in our weaknesses. And therefore there is a practical lesson to learn in this text in terms of humility, because humility is often a necessary trait for God's people. And it often means that we are humbled in all circumstances. And if we accept the challenge in terms of, Paul's reaction to the thorn was initially, he wanted to get rid of it, but ultimately he accepted the challenge. He accepted the race he had to run. He accepted the fact that this race he ran, this Christian race he ran, was not something that he could get away from in terms of pain, and yet he still overcame. So in concentrating on 2 Corinthians 12 from verse 7, we're concentrating on this in our Father's house, because the Apostle Paul is revealing how he had a thorn in the flesh and yet he overcame. He is revealing how that thorn may have been physical, it may have been emotional, it may have been spiritual, and yet in all things he overcame, because he accepted that in his weakness he was made stronger. So on our Father's House today, with me, Amanda Clinton, we're concentrating on Paul's vision and his thorn on 2 Corinthians 12, because in his weakness Paul is made stronger. And so if we identify with what particular pain we may be enduring because of a thorn in our flesh, be it in our family, be it in our marriage, be it in a circumstance that we feel as if we cannot overcome, if we focus on that too much, we might miss our blessing. And yet in focusing on the higher things, in focusing on the spiritual, in focusing on the things that are above and not below, we may be made stronger in our weakness, in that through grace we may overcome. Therefore, the thorn in your flesh this morning might be physical, in terms of your suffering some sort of physical ailment. It might be emotional, in terms of you overcoming something, or it might be spiritual, in terms of you might not be as close as you want to God, or you might have strayed away, or you might need him that bit more. That thorn in the flesh can also mean having a sense of sacrifice in this Christian walk. But in all things, we know that we have strength in grace. We know that we have strength in grace, because even in our weakness, we are made stronger. And therefore, though trouble will come, though the nature of our affliction may seem different, because we all go through different things day to day. We go through emotional things, we go through spiritual things, etc. We are made stronger in our weakness, because in that weakness we may overcome, because we learn how to overcome in adversity, and we are refined by that adversity. We are refined by that hardship, and we are ultimately tested by our trials. And I'm concentrating on Paul's thorn in the flesh ultimately, because the ultimate thorn in the flesh that we can see in the Bible is Jesus's thorn in the flesh in terms of his sacrifice. Because sometimes that thorn in the flesh might not be our weaknesses in terms of our spiritual or physical weaknesses, but it might be the sacrifices that we have to make, be it in family, be it in ministry, or be it in our future. And two particular sacrifices that Jesus made in his past is that he came down from heaven in a human body to help us learn about our Father, in terms of he was this physical representative that taught us how to be ambassadors in spite of our carnality, how to be ambassadors in spite of our physicality, and how to be ambassadors in spite of our carnality. And then he made that ultimate sacrifice with his life in order to atone essentially for our souls. And therefore the second sacrifice that Jesus made is that he died. He died to ultimately atone for our souls, and he died to ultimately make a form of blood atonement. And so as we concentrate on the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh in terms of 2 Corinthians, and he complains that even though he had these great revelations, he often had this thorn in his side, and we don't know if it was in a physical ailment, we don't know if it was in a spiritual ailment, we don't know if it was in an emotional ailment, but in all things we are comforted by this text in 2 Corinthians 12 because it allows us to meet, the text meets us essentially at our point of need, because whatever struggle we might be going through, whatever issue we might be going through, whatever trials we might be going through, be it in ministry or outside of ministry, we know that ultimately that whatever thorn is in our side, we can use it to our advantage, because in our adversity we are refined, in our adversity we are made stronger. So, therefore, if you missed me concentrating on the text earlier, I'm just going to repeat it for those who have just joined us. And the text was taken from 2 Corinthians 12, from verse 7 to 10, which states that to keep me from becoming conceited because of this surpassingly great revelations, there was given to me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in my weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. And that was just taken from 2 Corinthians 10, from verse 7 to 10, essentially, because the Apostle Paul is saying that when we are weak in our flesh, when we are weak spiritually, when we are weak emotionally, we may ultimately overcome, because we are made joint heirs with Christ. We are made partakers, because just as Christ suffered, and just as Christ was made perfect in his weakness, we too can join in this Christian lineage of being made more perfect in our weakness. And so, as we concentrate on Paul's vision and his thorn, we are concentrating particularly on this text, because even though we go through life sometimes feeling as if we have a thorn in our side because of a family issue, we have a thorn in our side because we can't overcome a certain thing in our workplace, we have a thorn in our side because we can't overcome a particular system that is, we view as not advantageous to the group, we have a thorn in our side because we cannot overcome a particular ministry in church in terms of it is not edifying the body of Christ, or whatever that thorn in your side may be it physical, emotional, or spiritual. We are uplifted by the Apostle Paul's revelation in 2 Corinthians 12 from verse 7, because he reveals the fact that even though he had these great visions, even though he was separated from other men called of God, because he was mighty in his works in terms of his revelations, he was humbled often, because he was humbled in having this constant thorn in his side that humbled him in terms of his mind, humbled him in terms of his ministry, and humbled him in terms of his interaction with his fellow man. And so, because the Apostle Paul does not reveal what that thorn in his side is, because he does not reveal whether if it was spiritual, whether if it was emotional, whether it was physical, we are particularly comforted by 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 7, because in our everyday need, in our everyday sacrifice, in our everyday weakness, we too can identify with the text and identify with it to the extent that we know that even an apostle was weak sometimes, even his reference to Jesus Christ in terms of, he often had to go through this, Jesus often had to go through this sacrifice, but we too can become joint heirs with these saints. We too can become partakers in this revelation, because in our weaknesses we are often made stronger. And in concentrating on Paul's thorn in the side, I thought I'd look up some quotes about how people have often been made stronger even in their weakness. They've often been made stronger in spite of adversity. They've often been made stronger in spite of circumstance in their life. And a text I found particularly, that was, a quote I found that was particularly interesting, was from Mahatma Gandhi, who said that the 7 deadly sins in life is wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, science without humanity, knowledge without character, politics without principle, commerce without morality, and worship without sacrifice. Because often we find in life that we often want to take the easiest road, the shortest path, the just more for less, essentially, in terms of more money for less work. And yet Mahatma Gandhi reveals that that is a deadly sin, because if we obtain wealth without work, we don't know how to value what we get. If we obtain pleasure without conscience, we don't have a sense of morality. If we obtain a knowledge without character, we don't know how to overcome in all circumstances, and we don't know how to lead, essentially. And if we obtain politics without principle, then our politics is often short-lived. And ultimately, worship without sacrifice means that we're not running this ultimate race, because we're not running the race that God ultimately set before us. Because in walking in a spiritual way, in doing this spiritual journey, one often learns that the cost of the Christian walk is often sacrifice. The cost of the Christian walk is sacrifice in terms of time, it's sacrifice in terms of being misunderstood, it's a sacrifice in terms of being separated, it's sacrifice because it will cost you something, be it in the physical, or be it because people will mock you. But ultimately, in this Christian walk, in the spiritual walk, we'll receive this ultimate prize, because even in death we overcome. And that's why 1 Corinthians 15 from verse 55 states, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" Because ultimately, in dealing in this spiritual currency, we learn to ultimately grow, because in becoming more spiritual in nature, even in death, we are not scared of death. We are not scared of where death will lead us, because ultimately we will just continue that spiritual journey. So as we concentrate on a particular text this morning, 2 Corinthians 12, about Paul's vision in his thorn, as we concentrate on the fact that Paul had this thorn in his side, and he doesn't reveal quite what it was, was it physical, was it emotional, was it spiritual, we are comforted, because we know that even in our trials we are refined. Even in our trials we become partakers with the Apostle Paul, and become partakers ultimately with Christ, because he often faced trials and he made the ultimate sacrifice in his life. And yet in all things we are made perfect in our weakness, because in our weakness we are made stronger. Because often if we have not been through something in life, if we have no story to tell, if we have no adversity to overcome, if we have no trials to overcome, what often happens is we are not refined. We don't go to the next level. We don't learn from that circumstance in order to grow spiritually, emotionally, and physically. And so in knowing that trials will come, in knowing that we too will overcome, in knowing that if we work through that problem we will overcome, we often have this ultimate prize that through grace, that we are set free. And we are set free because we are no longer a slave to whatever thorn that is in our side, in terms of we are no longer a slave in terms of serving that thorn. We're no longer a slave in terms of serving that spiritual ailment, but we overcome in terms of growing within ourselves. And therefore we learn ultimately how to prepare ourselves for that ultimate race in life, because as 1 Corinthians 9 from verse 24 to 27 state, "Do you know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way that you get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it for a crown that will last forever. Therefore do not run like a man aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating air. No, I beat my body and make it a slave, so that when I have preached to others, I will not be disqualified from the prize." And that's the Apostle Paul talking or stating at 1 Corinthians 9 from verse 24 to 27, where he's essentially talking about running this ultimate spiritual race in terms of training, in terms of refinement, in terms of doing it with an end goal, goal, doing it with an aim, doing it so that eventually when he runs the race he is not disqualified because he has, he's been made weak. He's not weak in terms of not overcoming, but in all his weaknesses he can learn to be refined, and he can learn to ultimately spiritually grow. And ultimately, in concentrating on the Apostle Paul, referring to his vision and his thorn, we're concentrating on this today on Our Father's House because ultimately it takes strength and energy in winning the race. It takes strength and energy because if you want to achieve anything in life, be it in a business, be it in marriage, be it in politics, be it in a system, and be it in your spiritual growth, ultimately we know that it takes strength, it takes energy towards winning that race, because ultimately you set a goal and you walk towards it. You walk towards it in such a way that eventually when you get to the end of the race, that you too will not be disqualified. And that's why Philippians 3 from verse 12 to 13 states that not that I have already obtained this or have been made perfect, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ took hold of me. I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining towards what is ahead, I press towards the goal and win the prize for which God has called me in Christ Jesus. Because ultimately it's about having strength and energy to run that spiritual race. It's about having the strength to know that in spite of your past, in spite of your shortcomings, in spite of what people might have said about you, in spite of all the things that may have gone to pass in your life, that in pushing forward, in pressing forward towards that higher goal in terms of that spiritual goal, that you may eventually overcome, because it's not that you have obtained, it's not that you are made perfect, but in pressing forward you are so much more ahead in terms of your spiritual growth than where you used to be. And that is all that we can endeavour to do as Christians, because we are not made perfect in our works, we're not made perfect in our deeds, but it is ultimately through grace, and it is ultimately in knowing that if we keep pressing forward, if we keep acknowledging the fact that we are not defined by our past, but refined by our future, and not succumbing to our weaknesses, then we keep on ultimately running the race. And in concentrating on the Apostle Paul's text today, Paul's vision and his thorn in 2 Corinthians 12, we know that we must often exercise our muscles of faith in terms of, when one goes to the gym, for instance, you exercise your muscles because you want to grow, you want to become stronger. And in this spiritual walk, we often exercise our muscles of faith in terms of we're becoming more refined, in terms of we are growing spiritually, in terms of we are reaching ahead and forgetting what is behind us. And that's why 2 Timothy 4 from verse 7 to 8 states, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. Not only to me, but also to all those who have longed for its appearing. And that's just taken from 2 Corinthians 4, from verse 7 to 8, because the Apostle Paul is talking about ultimately when we run that spiritual race in life, we finish the race in faith, because ultimately we will know that in the end, we'll just look death in the face and say, where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? As 1 Corinthians 15 verse 55 states, because we will no longer be in fear of death, we will no longer be in fear of shutting our eyes and knowing what is ahead, because ultimately in beginning that spiritual journey we are made perfect in terms of we just continue that spiritual journey in death, and we know what it is to believe in a spiritual system, we know what it is to sow into a spiritual system, we know what it is to harvest from a spiritual system. And in so knowing that, we know that when we reach our life's end, 5 minutes to death, we won't be anxious for anything, we won't be anxious for what will meet us as we close our eyes, because ultimately we would have grown spiritually, we would have learned how to deal in a spiritual currency, and we will ultimately learn how to overcome in all circumstance. So as we concentrate on our Father's house today, on 2 Corinthians 12, Paul's vision and his thorn, we're concentrating on this particular text today because ultimately we see the Apostle Paul was a man who was gifted in terms of the revelations that he received. He was gifted in terms of sharing the word of God. He was gifted in terms of reaching people because he received these revelations of God and not of man. And yet he was humbled in all circumstance because he had this particular thorn in his side, this thorn that he said he pleaded with God to take away from him because, it was often, it vexed his soul, it vexed his being. And yet a revelation was given to him that God will essentially not take away this thorn. And we learn when studying the text, we see that ultimately the thorn wasn't taken away because he was made perfect in his weakness. He was humbled in his weakness. He learned to overcome because he did not worship the revelations. He did not worship his distinction. He did not worship the fact that he was set apart. But in being humbled, he learned to overcome because ultimately he was, he spiritually grew. He learned not to rely on the gifts in his life, but to rely on God and to rely on the fact that ultimately that he is made perfect in his weakness. So if you've just tuned into our Father's house, you've just caught the tail end of the program where we've been concentrating on Paul's vision and his thorn, because often in life we face adversity in terms of we face a particular a thorn in our life, be it in our family life, where we can't seem to overcome a certain thing, be it in our spiritual walk where we feel as if we've strayed away and we don't know how to come back, or we might not be spiritual at all, or we might face a thorn in our life in terms of work, office politics, or church politics, and all these different things. But in this adversity, in dealing with other people, in dealing with our fellow man, in dealing with systems, in dealing with the fact that physical ailments might sometimes hold us back, in dealing with the fact that spiritual ailments might hold us back, in dealing with the fact that emotional ailments might sometimes hold us back, in all these things, in appreciating the fact that these ailments might never pass, in terms of they might be something that follow you all the days of your life, in learning to accept that this is a part of your life, you can overcome, because ultimately you can appreciate the fact that you are made stronger in your weakness, in terms of even though this adversity exists, you can still overcome in terms of focusing on what is above instead of what is below, and focusing on how it is that you can refine yourself in spite of adversity, focusing on how you can learn to ignore this thorn that might be in your side, be it physical, emotional, or spiritual, and just press forward to reach that higher goal. Because often in life we find that in reaching our higher goal, be it in our business, be it spiritual or otherwise, it often takes work, it often takes a refining process, it often takes exercising our spiritual muscles, it often takes overcoming in spite of what people said, in spite of what life might have said about us, in spite of our own shortcomings, but in appreciating the fact that we will always to some degree have a thorn in our side, because sometimes that thorn might just change, in terms of it might just be a different person, it might just be a different system, it might just be a different ailment. In learning to overcome in all these things, we are made perfect in our weakness, because we are stronger, because we don't rely on these things that make us weak, but we reach forward, we press forward in order for us to also obtain. So if you've just enjoyed listening to what we've been concentrating on in our Father's house. You can join me from Monday to Friday from 5:45 to 6:30, where I essentially concentrate on a particular text in the Bible and just draw out that text in terms of apply it to your everyday situation and apply it to your life in particular. You can also join me on our Father's house from 9 to 12 midday, where I essentially share the Word of God and build God's spiritual house by using this platform, which is a radio platform. I hope you have a fantastic morning and that you truly have been uplifted by that word.